All right. Well, when the whispering turns to a minimum, I guess that's telling us that it is about time to start. Good afternoon to the special Thursday colloquium. Today, we are fortunate to have Megan Mansfield from the University of Arizona. Megan, of course, is one of our candidates for our faculty search that's ongoing right now. So if you haven't had a chance to talk to her already, I hope you stop by and talk to her tomorrow. She'll be here most of the day tomorrow. Megan is a Sagan Fellow at, I never know what we call it, Sagan Hubble Fellow now at Arizona. Before that, she did her doctoral work at the University of Chicago with Jacob Bean and an undergraduate from MIT. So Megan is an expert at a whole wide variety of observational techniques and modeling work for transiting, particularly for transiting giant planets, but also working on lower mass, eventually terrestrial planets. So I think today she'll tell us about some of the early results from JWST and some other cool ground-based stuff that is ongoing. So thanks a lot, Megan.
Awesome. Thanks. So I get applause at the beginning before I've even done anything. Yeah, so thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here today to tell you a little bit about some of my work. Yeah, I'm mostly going to be talking about JWST here, but as Kevin said, I do some ground-based work as well, so if you want to know more about that, please feel free to ask me about it. So before I jump right into my research, I always like to motivate why I'm interested in studying exoplanet atmospheres. So for me, there's kind of three main categories of questions that I'm interested in understanding with these planets. The first is using exoplanet atmosphere compositions to track how these planets formed and evolved. The second is using their thermal structures to understand more about how different physical processes operate on planetary level scales. And then finally, of course, I'm interested in investigating the habitability of terrestrial planets. And I'm not going to have time to touch on all of these today, so I've just kind of put some citations along the bottom of work that I've been involved with on all of these, if you're interested in learning more about any of those. And of course, if you're interested in answering these questions about planet formation and evolution and habitability, we have this wonderful set of planets in our own solar system that we've studied in great detail with spacecraft missions. So things like these missions to Jupiter and Saturn and Mars, which have taken all of these beautiful images that you can see up here, gives a really incredible level of detail on information in our own solar system. But if you're interested in understanding planets and you just limit yourself to the solar system, then this is basically what we get. We get one set of planets, one outcome of planet formation around a single star. On the other hand, we now know of thousands of exoplanets orbiting thousands of different stars of all different stellar types. And so if we open up our investigation of planet formation to this broader sample of exoplanets, we can really start to get a much better sense over a wider variety of systems how planet formation happened. And not only do exoplanets give us a much broader population of planets to study, but they also give us access to parts of parameter space that we wouldn't have access to just in the solar system. So here all these black dots I'm plotting are all of the known exoplanets plotted in period versus mass. And just to kind of guide your eye, I've put some red letters up here that indicate our own solar system planets, Venus, Earth, Jupiter, and Saturn. And so you can see that in addition to just having a much larger population of planets, we have entire types of planets like the ultra-hot planets, which have very short orbital periods of a few days, and super-Earths and sub-Neptunes, which are intermediate in size in between our own Earth and Neptune. And even though we don't have one in our own solar system, we now know are the most common outcome of planet formation in the Milky Way. So we can use the exoplanet population to kind of broadly answer more questions about where this whole population came from. So if you don't study transiting exoplanets, I just wanted to give you the basics of what you need to know for the types of observations I'm going to be talking about today. So there's kind of three main ways that we can study transiting exoplanets. The first is in primary transit, which is when the planet is going in front of the star from our perspective. So in this case, the measurement we're making is we're seeing some of the starlight being filtered through the planet's atmosphere, and we can use that to measure the atmosphere's composition. Then the second is secondary eclipse, which is when the planet's on the opposite side of its orbit, so it's being occulted by the star from our perspective. And we can measure thermal emission coming from the day side of the planet and use that to get both its composition as well as the temperature structure of its atmosphere. And then finally, there's phase curves, which is where we observe a planet through an entire orbit around its star. So for everything I'm going to be talking about today, these planets are very close into their host stars, so we can assume that they're tidally locked. So just like our moon, they have one permanent day side that faces the star and one permanent night side that faces away. So in that case, if you think of a phase curve where you're watching the planet go through one full orbit, what you're actually measuring is the thermal emission as a function of longitude as the planet rotates. So today I'm going to be telling you about a couple new techniques I've been working on to study exoplanet atmospheres with JWST. So I don't think I'll be the first astronomer to come and give a talk this year that says JWST has completely revolutionized our understanding of exoplanets. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on these two new techniques I've been working on, spectroscopic eclipse mapping of giant exoplanets, and then detecting rocky exoplanet atmospheres with JWST. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about future directions that I want to go with this research with next generation telescopes. Okay, so first, spectroscopic eclipse mapping with JWST. So this project in particular that I'm going to be talking about is based on this data set that is part of this transiting exoplanet early release science program. So this was a huge collaboration of over 200 scientists that had a goal of doing the first exoplanet science with JWST and using that to test out all of the different ways the instruments could work for exoplanets. So you may have seen this beautiful cover that we got on a Nature journal last year where the first 5 papers from this collaboration were published. These papers were showing a complete inventory of the chemistry on this hot Jupiter WASP-18b. There were detections of lots of molecules. Particularly exciting was a detection of SO2, which was the first time sulfur species were detected in an exoplanet atmosphere, and also the first detection of active photochemistry in an exoplanet atmosphere. Today, though, I'm going to be talking to you actually about a second part of this program, which was published a few months later, which was focused on a secondary eclipse of the ultra-hot Jupiter WASP-18b. So here I'm showing a plot from a paper on this overall secondary eclipse observation, which was led by Louis-Philippe Coulomb. And I'm here plotting our data with these black points. They're in terms of brightness temperature, which is what I'm going to use for a lot of this part of the talk, just because it's much easier to see these little bumps and wiggles in the spectrum than if you were looking at the standard thing we look at in secondary eclipse observations, which is just flux of the planet divided by flux of the star, because that changes by orders of magnitude over the large wavelength range JWST covers. So the main results from this were that we detected water on this planet. That's these kind of, oh, I guess it doesn't show up on here. I'm sorry. There's supposed to be blue shading underneath these bumps in the near infrared, but I guess this projector doesn't like the blue. But we detected water in this planet. We also detected some sort of optical opacity in this slope up towards the shortest wavelengths, some combination, we think, of H-, TIO, or VO. And importantly for this planet, we were able to definitively rule out this model that had been proposed to explain previous observations with Hubble by giving this planet a high C/O ratio, and instead found that this planet was much more consistent with a family of models incorporating these high temperature chemical effects like hydrogen dissociation and water dissociation and H- opacity. And specifically what I'm going to be focusing on is that the high signal-to-noise spectrum that we got from this planet with JWST allows us to perform eclipse mapping. So eclipse mapping is this technique that we can use where, so again, we're observing the planet in secondary eclipse, so when it's being occulted by the star. And if you observe very precisely during the ingress and the egress as the planet is slowly getting occulted piece by the star and then slowly reappearing piece by piece on the other side, you can combine that information to make a 2D map of the planet's day side, so getting longitude and latitude resolution. This is something that had been done once before with the Spitzer Space Telescope, but with Spitzer, that data was limited to a single photometric band, so you just got one 2D map out of that. However, now that we have JWST observing at many different wavelengths, we can use different wavelengths to probe different altitudes in the atmosphere and actually stack these maps together to get 3D resolved information on the day side of the planet's atmosphere. So we get latitude, longitude, and altitude. But this is not a really straightforward thing to do. And the main reason is that there's lots of degeneracies in eclipse mapping. And that's because essentially what you're observing in your observation is just integrated flux over whatever portion of the planet is visible as a function of time. But what you're trying to get out is some resolved flux as a function of latitude and longitude. So there's no perfect proxies for that resolved flux in the observation you're actually making. So in order to kind of address some of these degeneracies, when I was a grad student, I developed this eigenspectra mapping method. So here I'm just showing kind of an outline of how this method works, but I'll talk through each of these steps individually and show how we applied them to WASP-18. Okay, so the first is that we start with systematics corrected secondary eclipse light curves of the planet. So I'm showing a few of those at different wavelengths here. That big chunk missing out of the center is the secondary eclipse, where the planet is totally behind the planet, or behind the star. And you'll see that there's also some kind of curvature in these. As I said, these are actually already systematics corrected. Those aren't leftover systematics from the instrument. That's actually real phase variation that you're starting to see, because WASP-18 has a pretty extreme temperature contrast between its day side and its night side. So even as we see part of that cold night side rotate into view, you can see this sharp drop off in the planetary flux. And in fact, we know that that's not leftover systematics, because this drop-off pretty well matches the models that we had for what we thought the circulation on WASP-18b might be like. So then the second step is we take single wavelength observations of this planet, and we use this eigencurves method, which was developed by Emily Rauscher, to make a resolved map of the planet at each individual wavelength. So the way that this method works is it takes a set of spherical harmonics and uses a PCA to turn those into an orthogonal basis of light curves. So the reason we do this is because the spherical harmonics, of course, are this orthogonal basis that you can fit in a space of resolved flux as a function of latitude and longitude. But again, that's not what we're able to observe. What we're able to observe is the integrated flux. So we use this PCA to turn it into an orthogonal basis in this space of integrated flux. So that's what you can see in this left-hand panel here. Those are all of these different eigencurves that we're fitting. And then on the right-hand panel, you can see the corresponding spherical harmonic-based maps that each of those components corresponds to. So first, I just want to show you what it looks like when we apply this method to the broadband white light curve of WASP-18b. So no wavelength resolution here. We're just summing over all of the wavelengths. So this middle figure here is showing the map that we get of the planet. The color corresponds to that brightness temperature that I'm using to show all of these results. And then the fade to white shows you places where we have relatively little contribution to the secondary eclipse, either because of the angle to the viewer at the poles, or because our observation only covered the area right around secondary eclipse, so we just don't have coverage over some longitudes of the planet. And then in this left-hand panel here, I'm showing a latitude-weighted longitudinal profile of the planet, centered at a longitude of 0 being the substellar point on this planet. And I'm showing in the red and the blue shading 2 different families of models that were pretty equally well fit to this planet. And then every other line on there is a pre-calculated general circulation model for comparison. So what we found in the white light curve was there were 2 families of different maps that could fit these data well. First, these red ones, which are sort of a standard hotspot model that you might consider pretty typical for this type of planet. It's got the hottest point right near the substellar point. It sharply decreases in flux away from the substellar point. And then the other family of models were these blue ones, which have more of an extended constant temperature plateau near the substellar point, but still show a similar steep drop-off towards the limbs of the planet, which pretty well matches our expectations from these models. So this is just another way to look at this. This is a video that was made by Ryan Challoner, who's a postdoc who's been co-leading this project with me. So these 2 little top panels of this video are showing those 2 different models, the constant temperature plateau and the central hotspot. And you can see the star coming in and occulting those in black. And then the little dot in the bottom is tracing where you are in the observation at that point. So then, of course, we can apply this to each of these wavelengths individually. So this video is stepping through what it looks like when we apply this eigencurves mapping at several different wavelengths. And I've just put, I'll say right now that a couple different times in this talk, I've put these like don't tweet symbols, just because these are things that are still in the process of being published. So if you could not share those outside the department, that would be great. But yeah, so you can see as we step through this video of all of these different wavelengths, you can see at some wavelengths, this central hotspot generally stays in this hotspot structure, but sometimes it gets broader or thinner or hotter or cooler at different wavelengths. And that's the kind of information that we're hoping to pick up at with this mapping. All right, so then what we do once we have each of these individual wavelength maps is we stack them all together. We divide our planet up into a grid of latitude and longitude points. We extract a spectrum from each point on the grid, and then we use a k-means clustering algorithm to identify regions of the planet that have similarly shaped spectra, which we call groups, and then take a mean of all of those points that are identified as being in that group to identify a representative spectrum, which we call an eigenspectrum. And the reason we do this is that at this point, you could imagine just dividing your planet up into a grid, extracting spectra from each grid point, and then running some sort of modeling analysis on every single one of those spectra. But you'd run into two big problems. The first is that you'd have a lot of spectra you'd have to analyze. So even if you had a 10 by 10 grid in latitude and longitude, you're already talking about 100 spectra. And then the second is that each of those spectra would have relatively large error bars because they would each take into account only a very small portion of the signal you're getting in secondary eclipse. So by using this clustering algorithm, we're able to decrease the number of spectra we have to analyze and decrease the size of the error bars on those spectra while still maintaining information about the variation in different spectral shapes that we see across the planet. All right, so this is what that looks like when we apply this k-means clustering to WASP-18b. So we identified 3 different regions, which I'm showing kind of color-coded on this map here so you can see where they are spatially. And then this right-hand plot is showing the representative eigenspectrum for each of those 3 regions. So we called this central one the hotspot region. It's centered right around the substellar point. And then there's this one we called the ring region, which is sort of in an annulus around that. And then this outermost region in black, we actually didn't focus on that much because, as you can see from this shading, it mostly covers a region of the planet where there was very little contribution to the actual secondary eclipse signal. So we're not really confident that we actually are measuring that at high fidelity. So just to compare those 2 spectrum in some ways, so here I'm just zooming in on the 2 spectra for the groups that we did analyze, so that hot spot in yellow, and then the ring around it in purple. And in black, I'm comparing those 2 spectra to the result for the full planet analysis in the original secondary eclipse paper. So that's not doing any sort of spatially resolved analysis. So just first of all, you can see that this full planet spectrum is sort of intermediate in temperature, but a similar shape to what we see for the hotspot in the ring group, which makes sense because we would imagine that the full planet should be some sort of spatial average of these 2 groups that are contributing to the signal. And then I've also overplotted on here with these lines some expectations for what those regions of the planet might look like from a circulation model. And so they definitely are not a perfect comparison here, but given the fact that these circulation models were fully pre-computed, not taking into account the data in any way, I think it's a pretty good match that they're about the same level in flux in brightness temperature, as well as having a lot of the same similar bumps and wiggles you can see pointing out different molecular features in these 2 regions of the planet's atmosphere. So then what you can do with this is you can run retrievals on these individual spatial groups to identify differences in the chemistry and thermal structure of different regions of the planet's atmosphere. So just for time today, I'm focusing just on this hotspot group. But here I'm showing in this left-hand plot temperature pressure profiles, and on the right water abundance profiles from several different models for this hotspot group. So the green and purple lines here are just 2 different types of free retrieval models where we were fitting for the chemistry in this region of the planet. The yellow one is actually a similar model, but that was fit to the entire integrated dayside observation, so no spatial resolution again. And then again, this black line is showing a prediction from a general circulation model, which was computed independently. So first of all, we can see that we get pretty consistent results between both the two different retrieval setups as well as this general circulation model in black. And then one really interesting thing to note here is that we see a slight preference for a lower water abundance in this hotspot region of the planet. That's really interesting because, like I said before, the observations of this planet indicated that it was consistent with having molecular dissociation. So WASP-18b is actually hot enough that we expect that water should break apart into OH and individual oxygen atoms in its atmosphere. And we would expect that process to be much more apparent and happen much more strongly in the hottest regions of the planet's atmosphere. So the fact that we see a slightly lower water abundance in this hotspot region may indicate that indeed we're seeing a region of the planet where there's more strong molecular dissociation occurring. And I also noted here that although I don't show it here because we didn't confidently retrieve a specific abundance, we did also detect the same optical opacity which we saw in the full planet observation, which again is interesting because those optical opacities are likely the source of the heating that's driving both the shape of the temperature structure we get here as well as that water dissociation that we're detecting. So just to summarize this part of the talk, this eigenspectra method was designed to extract information from spectroscopic eclipse mapping observations without relying on any pre-computed expectations for what the planet map should look like. And applying this to WASP-18b showed this central hotspot with a steep gradient in temperature near the limbs. We found two distinct spectral regions, a warm hotspot and a cooler ring surrounding that. And this hotspot showed a thermal inversion, some optical opacity, and a slightly lower water abundance than the full planet, which is consistent with what we think should be happening chemically in the warmest regions of this planet. So I've kind of thrown up a lot of words here on different things that I think would be interesting ways to go with eclipse mapping in the future, but I'll just highlight one of these right now, which is that this type of spectroscopic eclipse mapping is based off the same secondary eclipse observations that JWST is taking in a standard observation of a hot Jupiter. So I counted it up in cycles 1 and 2. JWST observed about 20 hot Jupiters in secondary eclipse, and we should be able to do this type of mapping for every single one of those observations. So I think there's a real wealth of spatially resolved information on these planets that is just waiting to be looked at. Okay, so completely changing topics. For the second half of this talk, I'd like to talk about looking at rocky planet atmospheres with JWST. And in particular, I've put in parentheses here rocky planets orbiting M dwarfs with JWST, because it's really going to be best optimized to be looking at these small planets around the smallest stars that we've detected. But one big question that we have for rocky planets around M dwarfs in particular is, how do we even know which of these planets have atmospheres? So M dwarfs are much more active than Sun-like stars, and in particular, they have very extended pre-main sequence phases where it's possible that their activity could completely strip atmospheres off terrestrial exoplanets, basically precluding the possibility for life in any of these systems. So kind of the first order question I'm interested in asking with JWST is which types of terrestrial planets around which host stars are even able to retain atmospheres for long enough that they have a hope of forming life. So this is a question that you could answer with any of those three types of observations that I mentioned earlier. So of course you could look in primary transit, and what you'd be looking to detect in atmosphere on these planets is the bumps and wiggles that would indicate different molecular absorption features in the planet's atmosphere. So this is something that people have started trying to do with JWST, and it's been really, really tricky so far. So there's several different reasons why it's hard in transits to get unambiguous information about whether these planets have atmospheres. So here I'm showing just one observation of the rocky planet LHS 475b. So these black points are all of their data from these transit observations. And you can see all these different lines running through, which are all different models that fit the atmosphere pretty well. So in this case, they weren't able to rule out a flat line from this spectrum. They were able to rule out certain types of atmospheres, like hydrogen-dominated atmospheres, which would have very large absorption features that you would be able to see. But when you detect a flat transmission spectrum, it's really ambiguous how you could interpret that. That could be that the planet has a very thick atmosphere, but it's got lots of clouds in it, and clouds are blocking your ability to detect any features. It could mean that the planet's atmosphere just has a very high mean molecular weight, and so any atmospheric features are much smaller than the level of precision you're able to get with your data. Or it could mean that the planet has no atmosphere at all. And with transmission spectra, once you've got a flat spectrum like that, it's very difficult to say anything more conclusive without doing more repeated observations. The other reason transits are really complicating to interpret is that they can be contaminated by stellar contamination. So this is this thing called the transit light source effect, which is shown in this diagram in the left-hand side here. Basically, if you have a star that your planet is transiting and your star is unevenly covered with star spots and faculae over its surface, then as your planet transits, if the chord of the star that the planet goes in front of is relatively more or less spotted compared to the mean surface of the star, you can get this wavelength-dependent bias that you introduce into your transit depths. So this right-hand plot, again, is showing an observation that JWST did in the past year, this time of the rocky planet GL486b. And you can see that in this case, they did not get a flat transit spectrum. Their data points show this slope up towards shorter wavelengths. But they were able to fit this equally well with models like those shown in blue here, which have a planet with a water-rich atmosphere, or the family of models shown in yellow, which are an airless planet, but that is being impacted by stellar contamination. So transits can be really hard because you can have things like clouds blocking your signal and stellar contamination confusing your interpretation, even if you do see a clear transmission spectrum. You could also try doing phase curves to look for rocky planet atmospheres. So this is something that actually even the Spitzer Space Telescope had started to do before JWST. So this is an observation of the rocky planet LHS 3844 with Spitzer. So here what you're looking at again is an entire orbit of the planet around its star. The transit is at orbital phases of 0 and 1 on the edges here, and the secondary eclipse is in the middle at a phase of 0.5. And what they saw in this observation was that it was very hot on the day side near secondary eclipse and essentially dropped to 0 temperature on the night side, indicating that it has at least no thick atmosphere, because we would expect a thick atmosphere to redistribute that heat around more effectively. But the problem with doing phase curves with JWST is simply that they take a very long time to observe. So these planets orbit once every 1 to a few days, which is really short compared to our solar system planets, but we really want to make sure that we're making the most efficient use of JWST possible. So what I've been working on is detecting rocky planet atmospheres with secondary eclipses, and in particular using the mid-infrared instrument MIRI on JWST to look at thermal emission from these planets in secondary eclipse and using that as a method for detecting atmospheres. So the concept that this is based on is very similar to the concept underlying those phase curve observations. So the idea, again, is that if we have a planet and it doesn't have an atmosphere, we would expect it to be in a maximally hot state on the day side. And that's because these planets, again, are expected to be synchronously rotating, so they would have one hot day side taking in all of the flux from the star. And without an atmosphere, they don't really have an efficient way to spread that heat away from the day side. And then if we add an atmosphere on top of that planet, that should act to make the day side colder or decrease the secondary eclipse depth in at least one of 2 different ways. So the first is that a thick enough atmosphere, about a bar or thicker, would be expected to transport heat around to the night side. So here I'm showing with all of these colored lines different models of rocky planet phase curves that were made by Daniel Cole. So again, for all of these different plots, the middle of the plot at a phase of 0.5 is where the secondary eclipse would be. And they're all showing with these dotted black lines a bare rock planet, and then the colors are showing adding progressively thicker and thicker atmospheres on top of that. And you can see for all of these planets that as you get to an atmosphere that's about a bar or thicker, you start to see a significant decrease in the day side temperature and a corresponding increase in the night side temperature as that atmosphere starts to efficiently redistribute the heat around. And then the second way an atmosphere can make the day side of a planet colder is that even a thin atmosphere can host high albedo clouds or hazes, which would reflect away some of the incoming starlight and act to decrease the amount of thermal emission you'd see. So here I'm just showing some calculations from a paper I wrote in grad school showing the albedo that you would expect for a variety of different cloud compositions. And just to guide your eye, I've dropped down these stars that show typical cloud and haze parameters for our three solar system terrestrial planet atmospheres. So essentially, the idea from both of these is just that a planet without an atmosphere should be relatively hot, and if you stick an atmosphere on top of that, that should make it colder. But in particular, this second point about the albedos, you might be thinking to yourself, well, how would I be able to tell a high albedo cloud from a just simply high albedo surface on the planet? So on our own planet, we know of all of these different high albedo surfaces. We have things like snowpack, rocks like granite, like what is shown here, that are really reflective and could be confused with clouds. But it turns out that all of the rocks that we know of on Earth that are very high albedo, or essentially all of them, somehow incorporate water into the mineral structure of the rock. So things like granites and clays can only form in the presence of water. However, if you got to a planet that was hotter than the runaway greenhouse limit, you wouldn't expect those rock species to exist on the surface of the planet anymore, because you would expect that the runaway greenhouse process would desiccate all of the rocks on the planet. So for cooler planets, we might be confused with a high albedo surface, but once we get past the temperature of that runaway greenhouse limit, we wouldn't expect those high albedo surfaces to form on these planets anymore. It turns out that as you get to really, really high temperatures, this sort of train of thought again breaks down, and that's because once you get to the hottest temperatures, substellar temperatures of about 1200 Kelvin or higher, you actually can start to get partial devolatilization of the rock. So essentially, the more volatile components of the rock, things like silicates, start evaporating, and you're left behind the most refractory components of the rock, which is corundum, or rubies and sapphires. So while this could make a really cool exoplanet to look at, this could end up leading you to like a planet that's entirely sapphire on the day side if you like evolved it slowly enough at the right temperature. Unfortunately, they're very high albedo, so that would also be confusing for distinguishing an atmosphere from a surface. However, in between these two temperature extremes, based on our understanding of solar system bodies, we think that the only types of surfaces that could cover a huge portion of a planet would be things like volcanic rocks like basalts that are all very low albedo. So in that case, we would expect a high albedo to kind of unambiguously indicate that you must have an atmosphere. It can't be a high albedo surface. So just to kind of summarize this concept then, we expect that there would be a really hot surface if a planet was just a bare rock. So you can kind of put a minimum temperature or a minimum secondary eclipse depth that would be consistent with a bare rock. So that's shown by the gray shaded region on this plot. And then if you observed an eclipse that was shallower than that, or a lower temperature, which is this kind of blue shaded region, then you could infer the presence of an atmosphere on these planets. So this is something that has actually already proven useful in the first year of JWST observations. So here I'm just showing one observation of the planet TRAPPIST-1c with JWST. Here they were just observing in one photometric band with MIRI, so their data is just this one red point here. And you can see that in this case, this was consistent with either being a planet with a small atmosphere, which is this kind of purple model here, or a planet with an ultramafic surface, which is this black model. That's sort of just like a high albedo edge case of these volcanic rock type compositions. But even with this just single observation, they were already able to rule out some other atmosphere models shown by these yellow and red lines that are more thick atmospheres that would be more like a Venus type planet. And again, I've put some no tweet symbols up here because this is some really new results, but I was really excited to show you some results from my own program that I've been leading with JWST, looking for a rocky planet atmosphere on the planet GL486b. So this is the one that I highlighted earlier that was also observed in transit, but it showed a sign of possible stellar contamination in the transmission spectrum. And what we've found here is our data are shown in black for the white light secondary eclipse observation. And I've compared that to, in pink, what we would expect for a zero albedo bare rock surface. And then this blue shaded region shows a set of different models that would be consistent with different atmospheric compositions. So we see about a 2.5 sigma difference between what we observe and what we would expect for a zero albedo bare rock, which we think is potentially the most unambiguous detection yet of a terrestrial planet atmosphere with JWST. And the reason we think this is the most unambiguous is there's one more component of this story that I haven't told you about yet, which is space weathering. So space weathering is this process that is essentially interactions of airless, the surfaces of airless planets with energetic particles from the sun. And in our own solar system, it acts very rapidly to evolve surfaces into these fine-grained regolith-type surfaces like what you see in pictures of the moon. And those have very low albedos. So GL486b is a mid-M dwarf, so we expect that space weathering around this star might happen at a much higher rate than what we see in the solar system, particularly because this planet is very close into its host star. So we think that the time scale to evolve this planet towards a very near zero albedo should be something like even as short as 100 years around this star. So even though we see only a modest difference between that zero albedo state and our observations, we think this could be really strong evidence for an atmosphere because we would expect a bare surface to end in that zero albedo state very quickly. So then I just wanted to show as well, we've only done, just barely started comparing the spectrum for this planet to different atmospheric models. So this one was an observation with MIRI's low-resolution spectrometer, so we do get some wavelength-resolved information as well. And this is just a really quick comparison where I've plopped it down on top of a few different models that we've run. But it looks like the most likely composition that we could be detecting here is something like a 1 to 10 bar atmosphere with something around 10 to 1,000 parts per million of different infrared absorbers like water and CO2 that make absorption features in this wavelength range that we were covering. So finally, I just wanted to mention something else that I'm really excited about with this technique is that the secondary eclipses technique for observing rocky planet atmospheres was recently recommended as a top recommendation for this 500-hour director's discretionary time community proposal. So this is this recommendation that Space Telescope was asking for there's going to be 500 hours of JWST time that are going to be devoted to exoplanet science. And they put together a committee of exoplanet scientists to go through community suggestions for what this time could be used on. And they recently announced that their top suggestion was using this secondary eclipses technique to do a survey of what's called the cosmic shoreline, which is the line in irradiation, either in bolometric irradiation or XUV, that divides planets that can and can't host atmospheres. So the idea is to build up a sample of these planets that are observed in secondary eclipse near this cosmic shoreline and start to map out how around different stellar types you get evolution of what types of planets are able to hold atmospheres. So I was really excited to hear about this because I really think that the power of this technique is not just in these one-off detections of atmospheres around specific planets, but really informing a detailed understanding of what types of planets and what types of stars are able to host atmospheres. So just to wrap up this part of the talk, this secondary eclipse photometry is an efficient method for detecting rocky planet atmospheres with JWST. And that's because atmospheres will act to decrease the secondary eclipse depth either through heat transport and or through hosting high albedo clouds. We applied this technique to observations of GL486b, and we think that they show the most unambiguous evidence yet for an atmosphere on a rocky planet with JWST. And then finally, this technique is going to be used in this 500-hour survey, which is really going to start to give us a population-level understanding of what types of planets can hold on to their atmospheres. So I'm almost at the end of my talk here, so I kind of just wanted to zoom back out to these questions that I mentioned at the beginning that kind of drive my interest in exoplanets. So again, that was using exoplanet compositions to track their formation and evolution, using their thermal structures to understand planetary physics, and looking at rocky planet habitability. So I haven't had time to talk about everything that I do today, so I kind of made you this crazy Venn diagram of how all of these different research interests of mine fit into all of these three big questions that I'm interested in studying. And I also wanted to outline a little bit what I'm excited about going forward in the future with different missions that will give us more ways to access some of these different questions. So in grad school, I focused a lot on Hubble. And as I said, I haven't had time to talk about it today, but I also, in the other half of my life, do exoplanet observations at high resolution using ground-based telescopes, mostly the Gemini telescopes now. So of course, JWST, as I showed, is completely changing the level of detail that we're able to get on these planets. And we now know that JWST as an observatory is likely going to be around for something close to 20 years. So this is really going to be a very powerful tool for the next couple decades in understanding population level questions about exoplanet atmospheres. But looking further into the future than that even, I am really interested in applying some of these techniques using high-resolution ground-based observations to smaller and cooler planets with the extremely large telescopes. And then even further than that, I think that these studies of what types of planets host atmospheres now will really nicely set the stage for doing detailed rocky planet characterization with the Habitable Worlds Observatory. So instead of a conclusion slide, I'm just going to leave you with this Venn diagram so you can see all of the stuff that you can ask questions about if you want. But thanks again for having me. It's been so great to be visiting, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Megan, for a really nice talk. We've got plenty of time for questions. All right. I'll throw it up that way.
Do you mean someone who can move faster?
Yeah, that's right. All right.
Well, great talk. Now, is there a potential with any of these techniques to detect aurora in the poles, which would mean that there's most likely an atmosphere, but not only that, but there might be a magnetic field? I mean, is this something there may be some techniques that could do that?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I guess I have a question for you well, we should talk about this because I don't know at what wavelengths you would be most able to see aurora. I mean, so most of my work focuses on near infrared stuff, which I don't think is the right place to look necessarily to see that. But that is a really interesting idea that you might be able to see that. I will say that actually with the eclipse mapping, so something I didn't mention, let me go back to this, is that it can actually already start to give you a handle on the presence of magnetic fields sort of indirectly. So I kind of glazed over these models because of time, but if you can see there's like two different green lines in here, it might be difficult to see from all the way back there. But one of them is very centered with like the hottest point right near the substellar point, and then one is shifted over a little bit. And the difference between those two models is that they have different amounts of drag intending to parameterize different magnetic field strengths in the model. So we think that because we see this planet having such a symmetric heat distribution around the substellar point that isn't shifted at all one direction or another, that actually might be an indication that it has a relatively strong magnetic field. So you can kind of get at that sort of information indirectly through this. Yeah.
Jeff.
Thank you for this great talk.
Mm-hmm.
Where its surface is, the regolith is, of course, modified by space weather effects, and the albedo is very low. But there's actually another interesting property of the lunar surface, which anybody in this room can find out very quickly by looking at the moon during times of close to full moon. The moon is very bright. There's a cusp in the reflectivity of the lunar surface as you approach full moon. And this is like a factor of 2 effect. It's been known for a long time, and we can all go out and observe this. The point I want to make is that the substellar point will be a region where a regular surface will reflect back more starlight than normal. So it could well be that the substellar point is darker than the region slightly away from it, giving this dimple in the blue curve.
Yeah, this is like opposition surge. Is that the
Yeah,
effect?
the moon acts like a mirror.
Yeah,
at full
so
moon.
we've actually, so it's difficult to like directly measure reflected light with JWST, mostly because it's optimized for infrared stuff, not optical. But we've actually been talking about looking for that brightness surge as kind of a way to confirm the existence of these like regolith surfaces.
Yes,
on an
I think
airless
that would
planet,
be a good test.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the interesting talk. And I'm actually doing space with the stellar M-dwarf layer stuff. And I'm asking, and you showed the GJ or GI486, and the space weather events can affect transit and spectra. And do you have any idea how to remove such effect, or in the future, or any simultaneous observations, or any thoughts about this?
Yeah, so let me see if I can find that again quickly. So yeah, so if you can see, like, so this was the one you were talking about, right? Yeah, so you can see they're like, these two models are very similar in the infrared wavelengths, but once you get to shorter wavelengths, they very quickly diverge from each other. So I think something that people have talked about for trying to be able to do this is like essentially doing like simultaneous or near simultaneous observations at shorter wavelengths as well as in the infrared wavelengths. And that can kind of give you a handle on it. It's definitely something that's important to do because the eclipses get very difficult when your planets get very cold. And so at some point approaching habitable temperatures, there really is no escaping the fact that you do have to use some transits in order to make it as efficient as possible. So yeah.
By the way, how old is this star? Is a very young active star or old inactive?
So this one is, I don't think well constrained age, but it's mature. It's over 1 billion years. So it's not a young star anymore. And my understanding from, I think there's some debate about how active it is. It's like photometric variability is not very high, but I believe there's been some observations of this with Hubble just recently that have showed a pretty high flare activity. So, yeah.
Yeah, looks interesting.
Hey, the occultation data that you showed in support of the terrestrial planet atmosphere seemed to show a lot of noise at the bottom of the occultation, presumably stellar variability. More noise there, though, than on the either side of the occultation. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so I think that's not actually stellar variability. I think that's actually residual, like, correlated systematics from the telescope itself. So this is like, I'll just say that this is a very rough and dirty first data reduction, and we're trying to work on removing some of that residual correlated noise. But yeah.
But it doesn't seem to be present in as great amplitude, at least on either side.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. Yeah. No, this is definitely still a work in progress, so.
Thanks. So with respect to your distinction between high albedo surface and an atmosphere, or a planet with an atmosphere, can you also use pressure broadening in atmosphere and the modeling of those of that absorption in terms of just because it's at a finite temperature? And the second kind of corollary to that is, can you also tease out, using the techniques that you mentioned with the PCA and all that stuff, can you tease out the Doppler, differential Doppler due to spin of the planet, and can you put some constraints on that?
Okay, so these are perfect questions for letting me talk a little bit about the high-res observations I'm doing, so thank you. But yeah, so you can't really see the like atmospheric broadening in any of these because these are relatively low resolution, so we're only getting like really broad absorption band shapes. We're not getting any detailed line information, but that is something that you can do at high resolution. And the winds is also something you can do at high resolution from the ground. So once you get to resolutions of like 100,000, so things that will be happening with upcoming instruments on the ELTs, and there's a few optical spectrographs that get to those high resolutions, you can actually start to see like small Doppler shifts in different lines due to like rotation and winds on the planet itself. So yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, you're handing back. Coming to you.
Really nice talk. I'm curious about the applicability of the secondary eclipse methodology here for the differentiating atmospheres for planets that aren't necessarily super close, right? So it kind of depends on the tidal locking and and getting that phase curve and that difference between in the temperatures. So as you go farther out, they're less likely to be tidally locked. Can you still distinguish atmospheres on those kinds of planets?
Yeah, so yes, you're totally right that whoops, I lost my mouse. There we go. You're totally right that it definitely depends on that idea of it being tidally locked. This observation, so one thing that you can do for planets that might be further out from tidally locked is that this one was particularly focusing on this photometric observation with JWST that's centered on this really strong CO2 absorption band. So that one is a little bit less like a like bolometric flux of the planet, measure the heat argument, and more of a just looking for that one CO2 absorption feature. So that's something that you can do for planets a little bit further out. I think mostly, for the most part, JWST is going to give us only really good data on planets that are near tidal locking. So it won't be a huge problem for this, but it definitely will be for things like habitable worlds and stuff, which will look at much further out planets.
I really enjoyed the talk. I had a follow-up on Jeff's comment that the other thing we see in rocky terrestrial planet or rocky airless bodies is infrared limb brightening, which is due to at close to zero phase because of the roughness of the surface. You get preferential emission back towards the illumination source. But my question was about the WASP eclipse light curves that you were looking at, and how the model. I wasn't surprised that the derived temperature pattern had that kind of sectoral longitudinal variation, because that's probably what is emphasized in the retrieval. But I was surprised that the model didn't have more of the zonal banding that we would expect from a giant planet atmosphere.
Yeah.
Is that a general result? Because I would think that planet has like a Coriolis parameter similar to Jupiter's.
Yeah, so actually, that is sort of a general structure that you expect for these. So basically, because the hot Jupiters are all tidally locked, they're rotating quite a bit slower than Jupiter. So you'd actually expect like the mean zonal circulation pattern on a hot Jupiter is usually more just like upwelling near the substellar point and this kind of global motion away from that, and you don't actually get the banding that you do on Jupiter, which is because it's a much faster rotator. So this is pretty normal for what you expect for hot Jupiter. I will say that for this one in particular, this observation is actually not ideally set up to give us latitudinal information. So it turns out that WASP-18b, we tested it on this one because it was part of this early release program and it was this first data set available, but it's quite limb on. It's very, the orbit is very edge on for the observer. So when it goes behind the star, if you imagine, the stellar limb is mostly crossing it in like a straight up and down line, as opposed to crossing it at some angle that you would get if it was slightly more inclined. So we actually aren't that sensitive to latitudinal information on this planet, and I expect we would get more of that with some other observations. Yeah.
Oh
my.
So these are like all the planets we can and will possibly be able to see with JWST are very close in around stars with horrific XUV environments.
Yep.
Regardless of their atmospheres, they're definitely not habitable. So what do you think is the the pathway, or what can we learn from these observations that can be applied to say anything about habitable planets?
Yeah, so I definitely think that the number one thing is just the presence or absence of atmospheres. Like if a planet that's close into its star that is interior to the habitable zone around an M dwarf is able to retain an atmosphere for a long time scale, then that opens up a whole new parameter space of planets in the habitable zone that could also probably retain atmospheres because they're at slightly less insulation. So I think that that's a really important question to be asking with JWST. Yeah.
Thanks, Megan. That was a great talk. Since you're already on this slide, I had a question about your method for getting these eigenspectra. Like, do you find, using k-means clustering, do you find that the spectra do fall into clusters, like with like discrete clusters, or do you find more of like a smooth variation?
Yeah, so basically the way we do this is we kind of like start with just like one or two clusters and then iteratively add more until, so basically we have like these planet maps and we have several different iterations of the map that were made in this like MCMC framework. And we do the clustering individually on all of the different maps. And you can usually tell like when you've added too many groups to the point where there's like, it's smooth variation and there's not these distinct ones, you get like mixing where at different realizations of the map, the same latitude longitude point will get assigned into different groups. So yeah, I don't know if I have a plot showing that, but I can show it to you if you're interested, but yeah.
Thanks.
We have time for maybe one more.
So HST was really the workhorse in this particular area for many, many years. Now JWST is a new kid in town with obviously advanced, more sophisticated capabilities. Are there any areas in the infrared where HST is still competitive? Or can we give all that time to us UV astronomers?
Oh no.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm gonna say something about it. I mean, I'll tell you that I have stopped submitting infrared proposals to HST because the TAC keeps telling me that it is not useful for infrared. There are still some things you could do with hot Jupiters in the infrared, but I will say that I totally get that argument because I think the truly unique capability of HST is the UV capabilities. And like for this interpretation of all of these rocky exoplanet observations, you also really need a UV understanding of the host star. So I cede my ground on HST. Yeah.
All right, any last questions? Okay, let's thank Megan again for a great talk.